Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'd like to kick off our next event here, our next session, Growth and Go-to-Market, the Next Billion Web3 Users. Our moderator is Parth Chopra, Principal at Bain Capital Crypto, with speakers Akash Gupta, General Manager at Ava Labs, Sarah Endline, Entrepreneur in Residence at Harvard, and Kelsey McGuire, CGO at Shardeum.
Cool. All right, first, thanks everyone for coming. Thank you guys for the organizers. Super excited to be moderating this panel on one of my favorite topics, which is how do you actually get users and keep users in crypto. We'll have a pretty free-flowing discussion today, and maybe to kick things off, we'll start. I know Chandler just gave a quick round of intros, but I think it'd be helpful for each one of you guys to go and talk a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you're working on today. So, Kelsey, do you want to kick it off?
Hi, everyone. I'm Kelsey McGuire. I'm the CGO at Shardeum, which is an auto-scaling L1. I started my career in Web3 probably early 2018 working with Consensus, so very Ethereum-focused from the get-go. I worked on community strategy and go-to-market, and then spent time at Cello, and then was also CMO at CoinFund, where I worked with a lot of our founders on quick and efficient processes and strategies around go-to-market.
Amazing. Sarah Endline, I'm an executive fellow and entrepreneur in residence for Harvard Business School and the Harvard Innovation Lab. I am a serial founder. I was at Yahoo about 20 years ago in Silicon Valley launching very early consumer products online. We did not call it Web 1, but that's, I guess, what it was. And then I launched a company called Sweet Riot, which was fair trade organic products sold at Whole Foods around the country. So very early B Corp, selling millions of units. And then I decided I should be back in the future of the consumer internet world, which is Web3. And I bring Web3 speakers to Harvard Business School, fellow entrepreneurs and practitioners. And also I'm working on a new concept called Sazzy, which is the Etsy of digital arts and digital crafts and digital collectibles. So if you're interested in that space, I would love to see you after.
Hey guys, I'm Akash Gupta. I'm head of product and of the consumer business line at Ava Labs, Avalanche. Thrilled to be here chatting with you guys. I actually was here last year as well, talking about something really similar to actually, I'm excited to share the developments in that space. Prior to that, I sort of think of my career journey in sort of two parts. One is sort of having my own startup. It was a B2B SaaS company for SMBs. Or working at an early stage startup out of the MIT Media Lab and during grad school. And then, after that, sort of moved to the Bay Area, moved to New York, was at large consumer tech companies like Meta, Uber, prior to Ava Labs. And at Ava Labs, kind of lead their entire wallet ecosystem, their bridge space, their explorers, and so on and so forth. So thrilled to be here with you guys and sharing some of the insights in the space.
It's super exciting. So we'll start high level, and then we'll go down into really fun topics of meme coins, tokens as well. But starting high level, what are some strategies, tactics you guys have found to be helpful in terms of crypto projects going to market and trying to grow from them? And what have you found that haven't been as helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I'll start from like a very, very practical standpoint, which is actually write it down when you're thinking about your go-to-market strategy. I've worked with different founders that are swept up in the wonderful enthusiasm of the space and what they want to do, and that leaves a lot that is not very clearly defined on paper. So really a lot of the tactics that I advise is clearly define your go-to-market based on your audiences and exactly which problem you're solving for them. Kind of wrap in a little bit of that product market fit component, and then design a channel by channel quick strategy that you can actually execute as a really small team or even as an individual that tends to rely on more top of the line types of thought leadership pieces and sifts everything down into eventually how-to type of content and activations across all of your channels. So really it's just focused on providing value every single step of the way and not just sitting somewhere and pitching the really wonderful and interesting thing that you're doing to an audience without really helping them see what you're actually doing for them. And that's where I feel like also a lot of people can kind of miss the point a little bit, or things that don't work tend to be pieces that are highly oriented towards just what you're doing. I kind of compare it sometimes to that person at a party. You go there, you want to talk to the person who's kind of asking about you and wanting to understand you, rather than the person that's just talking about their house and their car and everything that they're doing, because you're not going to have the same level of connection with that kind of person. And that really translates to a strategic brand level as well.
This is a CMO at heart for sure. I love this. Just a quick pulse check. How many of you are in the space of blockchain already? Pretty much almost everyone. How many of you are founders? Okay, really cool mix. Harvard? MIT? Northeastern? Other? Very cool mix. Okay, awesome. So when I started studying, deeper in the Web3 space, one of the things that really surprised me was that everyone was really talking about technology and talking about creators, which I believe in, but there wasn't a lot of conversation about consumers. And so building on what Kelsey already said, well, number one, I always tell founders and early stage people in general to journal and write it down. And for sure, keep something by your bedside, whether it's the phone you're going to write in or a piece of paper, because some of the best thoughts are on airplanes, late at night, while you're dreaming. So it's write things down however you want to write them. Just please do it, because it's really helpful for reflection and planning in general. So super agree with that. But for me, what I was realizing is who's talking about the consumer? Aren't we supposed to be designing around the consumer and what they actually want? And it's this conversation constantly about what chain and the creator, and that's all important. But to me, what is the most important is what's your problem? What's your solution? Who are you designing for? And then you lean super into wait, where do they live? Where do they work? Where do they play? This real classic thinking around how am I going to find that person? And so in my current venture that we're designing, I have a very particular thesis that there is for sure a lane for digital collectibles and financial trading and speculation, and that's fine. I think there's another lane to be created, and I think that's a lane around self-expression and collecting and the real consumer that controls 85% of purchasing, and that's a woman. And so we are designing around her. And I use her or sassy women a lot in our deck and in our language and in our conversations, because I want us to keep really centered on her. That's who we're designing for. And so we have to put her first and think all of our questions through around that lens. And then the other thing I've certainly seen that I believe is really important in go-to-market is just, the soft stuff, which is culture. And the soft stuff is what's your mission? What are your values? What do you care about? Because you're trying to connect your consumers and your communities to that kind of overall culture. And it sounds soft and kind of maybe not so relevant, but actually it's super, super relevant. And if you read books like Jim Collins' Built to Last, or you ever listen to, Steve Jobs, culture is very present in great companies and in great projects and great initiatives. And so thinking through what do you stand for, and that's how you're going to find the people that will be a part of your movement.
Well, happy to add a little to what Sarah's saying, actually. Some really interesting, astute points. The way we think about consumer right now is actually just thinking about who are the users of the chain and what those exact use cases are. So actually starting with the use cases in mind, we've kind of broken down consumer products or just the consumer into different kind of verticals or sub-verticals or categories. Obviously, NFTs is something, and digital collectibles is something that really drives users on chain. Allows activity, allows speculation as well. And then actually the user experience layer is something that's heavily thought about and talked about. Is something we actually really strive to move towards and make things as interoperable and seamless as possible. So we have a technology called subnets, of course, that folks know a lot about. But being able to move assets from one chain to another chain seamlessly, reducing the fragmentation is actually what users really want. So starting with the user's needs in mind, and then slapping some sort of technology on top of it is kind of like the approach that's really worked, right? So I think if we keep just think about, hey, what's the best technology out there, and then just like start with that in mind without really knowing what the users are really asking for, is just like kind of engineers hacking in a room and debating about things, but no one would actually end up using it. So that's something that we realized pretty early on was like not really working for us. So we were part of these projects, these developers, these folks who are like, hey, we actually just want to build out our game. We just want to use this NFT. We just kind of don't really have any like issue when it comes to building out our own sort of use case here. So start with their exact use case. Guide them, handhold them. That's something that's really worked. And I'd seen a little bit of a change in this kind of model when it came to driving that growth and making sure that people actually stick after that growth as well, which we can actually touch on a little later. But I just wanted to add on to that point that Sarah was talking about. So pass it back to you for that.
Yeah, I think one last point there too is that some of the best strategies I've seen when you're thinking about the consumer, your target audiences, is not only breaking down who they are, where they are, kind of what motivates them, but also really seeking to understand how they want to see themselves. Because that can be sometimes a little bit different from the reality of these individuals and their audience segments. But if you're able to tap into that and sort of design a community around that, you're really onto something, even though that can be quite a challenge at times.
On that point, Kelsey, can you talk a little bit about community building and what have you seen work really well there? What are some mistakes people have done in trying to build? So especially some of these are ecosystem projects. People are trying to get developers, users at the same point. So I'm curious what you've seen.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start with some of the things that have created a lot of challenges for projects that I've worked with. A lot of that revolves around not setting very accurate timelines. And communities, especially
like project
communities,
timelines or
yeah, project timelines, release timelines, just really it boils down to setting accurate expectations and clear expectations. And there's a lot of forgiveness within communities that are already sort of with you on a specific project, but everyone has a breaking point. And if you're consistently not setting appropriate expectations around either what you're building, the experience you're providing, even events, meetups, anything, that starts really eroding the trust. And once you start losing the trust, you're losing your community. Things that I think work really well that I've seen time and time again over the years are these in-person experiences and moments like this actual event that we're having now. A lot of the conversations and camaraderie happens at in-person events. I know when I started in Web3 years ago, it was my first remote job. It was pre-pandemic, and I was like, oh, are we just all going to be behind our computers all the time? I won't be seeing people. But that turned out to be very much not the case at all. So I really recommend when you're thinking about creating a community, it's not just communicating and adding value and educating on whatever channel you choose, whether it's Discord or something else. It's making sure that you are physically there when you can in your core areas or cities, having these meetups, having these opportunities to collaborate, and really leaning on community building from a partner strategy perspective as well. I think that forming those relationships, then making sure that you're collaborating in person and both, creating that through your community channels is really important. And sometimes it's something that we miss a little bit since all the projects are excited about what they're doing. Make sure that you're understanding what those sort of meeting points and joint narratives are when it's a community building type of strategy.
So Scott Commoners, how many people know Scott Commoners from Harvard Business School? Great professor, awesome. Just wrote a book, if you haven't seen it, it's called Every Token. It's leaning into NFTs, and he says everyone can find a tribe. And so what I think is really amazing is you can really, in today's world, find these micro communities and tribes. And so when the Facebook started at Harvard, right, that idea of a community online was so new. And now we're at this point of like, literally there's a new Chateau community that was like launching at Paris Blockchain Week if you want to be in a castle tribe, right? And I was just at NFT NYC, as was Kelsey. You probably were too. And what was interesting is I was going to different events in a way to partly see what were potential partners for SASE, but also just to watch how different tribes worked. And so obviously, like, I'm involved in the world of women and Boss Beauties and Hug and some like really amazing women's communities, very mission-based. They, you walk into the room, it is honestly, more women are in the room, it is more colorful in the room, it feels more feminine, it's so different. And then like, I ended up at a Bitcoin ordinals brunch and it was like, me and 20 guys, and that's fine, but again, different, like totally different tribes. And that tribe was like totally like pure Europe, North America. And then that same night, I went to Pudgy Penguins, which maybe you guys were there. And it was like, a giant multi-level club with like penguins hanging everywhere and like, again, like 7 women. And that's fine. It's just fine. It's about kind of like leaning into like who's the crew that you want to sit and play pool with or whatever you're up to. But I think, again, these are just examples of like how micro communities are manifesting themselves, and they are showing off their culture and what's important to them. And of course, at Pudgy Penguins, there was absolutely a giant merch center with really cool stuff, and that is like really central to their culture. Whereas at like the Ordinals brunch, it was really literally just a chat about what were they going to buy next, right? So I find this whole world really fascinating. And again, if you're building something or if you're joining something, getting really clear on like what tribe do you want to be a part of is really important.
Sarah, maybe a follow-up to that. How intentional should founders be on creating that specific community versus letting it organically emerge? Like, what do you think is the right balance for early stage projects?
I think you want both, but if you start with like no soul and like no core values, then it could organically manifest itself into something that like you're like, oh my God, what have I created? Shit. So I think you want to have some sense of like, I do literally call it soul. I don't like the word branding. I like the word movement. I like the word soul. I like to talk about culture. And if you have no sense of what you stand for, right, then who's going to show up for you? And I almost compare it to politics. Like, I think the tough thing about for politicians is they might actually have values, and then suddenly they have to let go of their values to try and like represent their constituents. And so it just becomes a conflicted profession, right? Whereas as founders or entrepreneurs or like movement builders, I think we can come up with at least something so that it organically grows in the right way.
Everything. Cool. And so you guys all have very rich backgrounds before coming into crypto as well. And so I'd love to kind of just hear a little bit about lessons you might have learned previously, especially when it comes to thinking about customers, retention, CAC, those kind of things, as well as just general, like what you've seen work really well in Web2's ecosystems. What are lessons we should take from that here? And then what are things different, right? Crypto is also its own unique, different world and ecosystem. Akash, you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. Happy to kind of give it a shot and then pass it over. So I was really lucky to kind of see that astronomical growth at Uber, at Meta, at Staples.com when I was there as well, when they moved from a retail kind of giant to like a .com e-commerce company that was sort of third after Amazon and eBay. So it's really interesting when you actually think about the cold start problem. If you actually read the book by Andrew Chen, you probably read a little bit about it there as well. But seeing how you actually seed the marketplace is really important. And in Web3, you kind of have a similar two-sided marketplace, right? You have the developers, and then you have the users or the consumers and the people on chain who are actually just traders. And we could kind of break down the type of consumer and the persona. But what I actually really noticed was in the go-to-market strategy of Web2 was that it was very top-down driven, right? You have a leader setting a mission, and this is a goal of the company, and this is what we want to do. And if you think about the mission of Meta and Uber, of course they've done really well, but it wasn't really empowering the drivers, the early users who came onto the platform, and they weren't really given a token. So imagine that first 1,000 or 10,000 drivers who came onto the platform, if they actually owned the Uber stock, right? How much more incentivized they would have been, as opposed to like the employees at Uber, of course, who are building, the ride matching and the algorithms of like what they call Michelangelo at the time. But if we think about that transition when it comes to Web3, right? We actually have moved from like this idea of the stock ownership to things being more community owned, and that entire model has been really amazing to see, where you see users, early users being rewarded in the form of a token when you actually participate in the project, you provide feedback, you get a lot of learnings out of the people who are actually using your protocol and providing you insights in sort of a good way, right? In making sure that your product's getting better over time. And that's something, I feel has really inspired people and like changed that mindset in terms of making sure that we're actually moving from a write era to an own era, right? We kind of have probably seen this book all around the event today. It's Chris Dixon's Read, Write, Own. So, it's something that's actually really sticky and drives retention in the longer term. So we are at this like juncture in the kind of Web3 era as well, where we really don't know how this is really going to play out, but there's a lot of conviction and a lot of faith where, early adopters who are actually moving towards this model are actually having astronomical gains, but also finding product market fit a lot faster, driving growth a lot faster, and it's actually leading to like real retention of the users as well.
Yeah. And maybe a quick follow-up to that. You're one of the projects that's had a live token for a couple of years now at this point. So have you guys changed the strategy of how you view that as like a growth lever from the early days to today? Is it more retention now? How do you think about it now?
Yeah, so it's actually really interesting when we think about a bear market where it was last year. This kind of room was half its size at some level, but when we think about growth now, it's really different, right? We have different verticals. Like when we think about gaming, it's a very different retention strategy with our tokenomics and with subnet or gas tokens that are actually being used as well. And I've seen this like airdrop kind of mania going on, and like the reward system going on, a loyalty point system going on, when drives to like driving growth and retention. So we're actually trying to adopt different ways to make sure that users actually feel loyal to the chain, feel like they're actually building something that's meaningful, something that's interoperable. So if they actually build something on subnet A, they can easily move that sword or that shield from subnet A to subnet B, despite having spent hours on game X and moving to game Y now. And building that underlying infrastructure and allowing those tokenomics to sort of accrue and transfer without having to leave that underlying blockchain is something that we've seen a lot. So even though, for example, there's a lot of activity happening on Solana, and that's obviously single chain and it's doing amazingly, we have an immense amount of activity happening on a bunch of different subnets that are powered by the Avalanche infrastructure. So you have the Beam subnet, you have the Gonzilla subnet, you have Dexalot, and they're individually doing a bunch of transactions that if you add up, right, it kind of changes. But we're not looking at the primary chain now because of the app chain model. So back to your initial question around tokens, I think it's a little skewed on how you kind of you look at success in that regard, right? Are you looking at individual games that are built on underlying infrastructure, or sort of single chain infrastructure as well? So both are amazing and have their kind of growth kind of dynamics, but it's definitely interesting to see how that would play out.
Very cool. I guess there's also some like interoperability, and you start getting network effects across some of these things as well. We're on these subnets, but.
Yeah, I think I'll pass this over to you in a minute, Sarah, because I think you have a lot to add here. I did not work in Web 2 before making the transition over to Web 3, but I did learn a few different things that I feel like really do translate well. There's a lot of unique little Web 3 only things, but really when you think about it, we're people creating things for people. So something that's been really helpful for me to revisit is the types of tests and feedback that we sought after when I was working at these other types of projects in the fashion or beauty industry. So really trying to determine what your core audience, consumer, whoever you're after wants, and actually listening to them and implementing that whenever it makes sense. And then I think secondly, really focusing in on behavioral science. I think that there's a lot of interesting things that drive humans and things that cause kind of relatively consistent reactions when you pull those specific levers. So I think really diving into that a little bit is actually helpful and does translate really well across whatever industry you're in, as long as you do it with the appropriate level of respect and not just trying to manipulate people.
To build on both of you, so back at Yahoo, I remember learning what was called human-centered design, and I was like, wow, this is like super cool. What is this? And I spent a lot of time in what we would call the GUI department, which you don't even call GUI that anymore, right? It's like the design department. And then that became called design thinking over time. And literally last week in Paris, we were talking about CAC, and this is kind of going to Akash's point, like, CAC is customer acquisition cost. And acquisition, its word means pull. I'm pulling someone in and I'm paying for them. And so I started to say, actually, I think we're in an era of CCC. We are in customer community cost, or community creation cost, right? So I literally, even in Sazzy's deck, I'm like, we're a zero CAC player. And people are like, how can you be zero CAC? It's like, well, you're investing, but you're investing in community-centered design. You're investing in community events, community like engagement, co-creation for sure, which you're talking about this like how is everyone really involved? And so it's not about CAC. It's not a like Facebook ad pull strategy at all. It's like all of the investments are going to be around this community co-creation and design, and that is super different. Like, we could not operate like that back in the day. It was almost like it just wasn't possible. Like, imagine I was at Yahoo Mobile and we had triple tap phones, like non-iPhones, like trying to figure out how Yahoo Mail and Yahoo Shopping was going to look. Like, co-creation was like or community-centered design, we weren't there. And so to talk about like reflecting, back, I think we are in just this amazing state of like beautiful technology that we can utilize for things like community, for things like design, whether it's via tokens or it's via points and rewards or whatever it may be. I think I think Web3 is like so powerful and interesting because of this concept of, again, I don't even know if it's CCC or co-creation or whatever we're calling it or coining it, no pun intended. It's super important to stay focused on it.
When do you guys think is the right time to lean in more towards growth? And the spirit of this question is I see a lot of projects that I don't think have found full product market fit, and they're maybe starting to launch points programs, and it's actually masking their customer behavior. Like, if you look at like some of their dashboards, you actually don't know who real users are or not. And so I'm curious, like, what have you guys seen as the right time to lean on it? Is it something you should, Sarah, maybe it's like you're always building community on the backside, right? When is it the right time to lean towards it versus being like, hey, let's go back towards a more product development and figure out what the core value prop of what we're doing is?
This is like the $1 million question, right? Like, it's so, how do you time it perfectly, right? And one of my advisors, Luke Kerner, if you've ever met him, like really, he started Crypto Mondays. He's a big community builder, and he worked at Idea Lab in like, I don't even know, like the 90s. And he's Bill Gross, who was like a super early internet guy, if you ever read him. He's like, you used to think it was about like the team, or you think it's about product market fit. According to Bill, it's about timing. So then how do you predict the timing, right? Like, I don't know. You're from Bain. You answer this question.
I don't know if I learned from this. I used to work at OpenSea, and it was very, and at a company before this, very interesting to see when you find product market fit. And I think it's weird. It's every single project has its own way. And I think the advice I always is that people are like, oh, like some people are using, you have to find people that really love it, and you don't need that many, right? I think the mistake is that everyone's like, let's get 1,000, whatever, a couple thousand, right? You just need like 5 to 10, and you really need to solve something unique in there. You need to be a unique representation to them. If it's not working, like focus, narrow, sharpen your value prop, right? And I feel like sometimes people, especially in crypto, sometimes go too much towards growth, and sometimes it's important, depending on what you're doing, to like think about a points program may be part of the network that you're building in. Like that is part of the product, and I think it's okay to think about it in that way, but it's always, I think you should always go back to, it's like, what is the role you're serving for your customer?
Parth, I think that's super smart, and I think one of those like really classic Web 2 examples is how Airbnb picked up on the fact that New Yorkers were loving this service. So they went and they hung out, they like stayed in a bunch of New York apartments, they hung out with a bunch of early customers, and then they realized this, one of the things that was really broken were photos. And like just crappy photos. And they just went and they like, this is like this tiny little tweak, they helped fix it. And that was one of their growth levers. It sounds like such a crazy small example, but it is an example of they were finding some of their core fans and spending real time with them.
Another interesting example for OpenSea, most of the early growth was actually links. And so there's this always question of like, is OpenSea a destination or is it an infrastructure tool set? And if you just look through full story, go through some of the things, you start to see that it was like actually being the default links place. And so there's actually a lot of work done to being, hey, as soon as an NFT collection drops, you're the first one to index it. And you have a clean page that comes from it. And so, I tend to be a product guy. I'm always like, just look to see what customer behavior is. And once you recognize that, you're like, okay, the number one thing you need to win on is indexing. As soon as it comes out, you need to be the first one there. You have a generated link from there. People start sharing that on Twitter. And that's what gets that flywheel really going. And I think it's figuring out those like hacks and those fly loops for your product is really important.
Here's a really quick one. Like at Yahoo, I remember a hallway conversation where people are like, people are really watching those movie trailers. Like they love video. It's like, it's got this crazy uptake. And we were all like, what? And it was so early that you didn't even know people were gonna love movie trailers, and they did. And so finding these little tweaks is really amazing.
I'm happy to add a little bit from a slightly different angle, right? I think it's really hard as a developer to really know when to like believe in your project, or as a developer, I mean like a founder now, given that, you know, if you're just picking a chain, or you're like, hey, when should I invest in marketing? When should I invest in technology? Should I hire head of growth, or should I hire, you know, my third engineer to like build this out, or should I hire someone who's gonna like design the best UX out there to make this better? So I think the aspect that I think has really worked would be kind of looking at each function individually. So like pivoting your technology, refining it, you know, fine-tuning it whenever you really need to. The second thing would be making sure that your messaging, your positioning of your product is actually really good, and then fine-tuning your growth, looking at organic growth versus paid growth, like trying all the levers and the best practices on like different functional sides, design growth, right? So looking at design thinking, human-centered design, a lot of what you said, how do you move you know, assets or tokens from one chain to another, as simply like getting back to first principles on making sure that you're solving the right problem at all points in time, and being true to your purpose and vision is something that's really helped. It keeps founders on track in general, you know, because it's really hard, especially the last 2 years, to actually, you know, build out a product that's really been sticky and still see users and still see them actually retain and use your product. So one thing that I feel I, you know, always tell people on my teams is like, it's about, you know, preparation meeting opportunity, right? So let's prepare, let's like do the right things, let's, you know, stay true to our mission, stay true to our vision, and the opportunity will come. And the opportunity is here, right? We've, you know, put in the seeds, we've been gardeners for the last like, I would say 2 or 3 few years now, since, you know, a bunch of, you know, bad actors and the collapse that happened in 2022. And now we're here, right? Like we are seeing the fruits and the rewards in many ways. We're seeing adoption. We're seeing that institutions are coming here. And now is the time to maybe, you know, pounce, because the preparation has now finally led to the right opportunity, or we are seeing the tailwinds kind of go in favor. So I think now is a good time to maybe think and repivot. If you're a founder, be like, hey, I want to move from like, you know, building out the technology. Hopefully you did that when it was time to prepare. And you are now moving to like the hyper growth and like focusing on, you know, turning on the growth levers in your company. So having a good balance there is something that, I just wanted to call out in terms of, talking about both sides there.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think the one thing I would add to that is just making sure that you have that kind of foundation on the product side, so you actually have something real that you're doing and building, and you're not sort of leaning into or slipping into becoming some sort of hype machine. And I've seen some different projects sort of fall into this a little bit, and some intentionally, really diving headfirst into it. And you really won't build longer term authentic community. You won't see that sustained growth if you're heavily relying on just hype with nothing behind it. So it's really important to always keep that in mind. I saw a lot of projects fail sort of early on that relied on that too heavily and really got swept away there.
So we have about 8 minutes left. And one topic I think in the zeitgeist that everyone's curious about is meme coins. And I think there's different points of views on its staying power, its role in community building and go-to-market. And so would love to hear from the three of you on your thoughts on meme coins, its role into it. And Akash, I know you guys just launched a cultural fund, so maybe you want to kick things off and then.
Yeah. So we took a more proactive approach at Avalanche. The foundation was like, hey, meme coins are here to stay, kind of like pop culture when, there was the kind of world of rock and roll of, people trading trump cards and like basketball cards and all these cards. And we were like, hey, there is an activity, there is activity when it comes to building out the computer culture, which is making sure that you're building the best chain that's scalable, that's decentralized, that's working, that's fast and cheap and so on and so forth. But you can't stop the wave of people from like using certain aspects of the chain when it comes to making sure that they just want utility and fun, and the casino culture still exists, right? So that's sort of the kind of mantra that we employed when it came to meme coins. And so we launched a $100 million fund to support community coins, community tokens is what we call them, where you have to fulfill a certain criteria. You have to have certain amount of liquidity and unique holders and so on and so forth for it to qualify as a meme coin that the token's going to support, that the community is going to be supported on. And I think meme coins is actually a pretty interesting use case to actually drive stickiness, right? We see things that we actually don't see in other models or in other industries. We've seen Dogecoin and Shiba, these things explode, and they're still here. They're still like top 20 coins, and they've sort of stayed. Dog with Biff and whatever, it's a Biff with hat or whatever.
So
I think it's pretty cute. People like it. I think what's really interesting is the gamble culture or the gamble-fi culture. And that's something that you need to kind of stay away from a little bit, but you still need to support what people are actually asking for and why they're using their chain. They want to be traders, they want to be DeFi degens, they want to move from one narrative to another, they want to like play around and use your chain for it, right? Right now we're seeing a lot of activity on it. I think people want to move from maybe Solana to Base to Avalanche to Arbitrum and so on and so forth. So let people kind of enjoy that and support that in a certain way. And I think it actually builds to what you were saying early on, right? Like finding your tribe, being hyper-local. And now I think people are actually talking about it a lot. So it definitely drives activity, drives engagement. There's a lot of hype and vaporware around it as well. So you got to be careful on what you're already doing. And you can easily be rugged or honeypotted and a bunch of terms like that on crypto Twitter or crypto X. But I think it's something that actually helps drive the community. I was in New York and I was looking at the ad on top of a yellow cab, and it said Roost on Base. And I was like, okay, wow, Base doesn't have a token. People want to get excited about Coinbase, and Coinbase, I was like, Coin is obviously the token ticker on Wall Street, and then there's Base, which is the chain, which obviously is a really interesting model that they've actually built out, and I think you can't really stop people from like moving assets from one chain to another, maybe being like traders, and but what you can do is actually you can create systems around it to make sure that they are not rugged, or they can move the assets seamlessly, and eventually you have to kind of empower people through self-custody in these situations anyways.
Yeah, I do think that they're really interesting, and it can be a way to sort of engage with and find your community. I really like some of the use cases I actually learned about a little bit more recently with meme coins and Web3 social media. I was chatting with a journalist the other day, and his little community was starting to use meme coins, so they actually had this interesting sort of utility component to them to pay for and boost different pieces of journalism. It was really interesting. I think that that one was on Lens, if I'm not mistaken. So I think there's a lot of fun things that you can, work on with meme coins and sort of engage with and play with. I think the one thing overall, and this kind of applies to a lot of different aspects of Web3, but when it comes to meme coins, understanding that this is yet another layer of new things that can sometimes be alienating to the general public, and really being mindful of kind of figuring out how do we communicate about meme coins and how do we sort of weave this into some of the overall narratives we have around, Web3 being kind of ready for institutions and some of these other audience segments that might be a little bit more nervous about something when they hear it's a meme coin or something along those lines. But, we're seeing a lot of exciting things pick up in that department as well.
Really interesting. I want to make sure that Parth gets in here in our last few minutes. We want to hear what you think. But I will just say that I don't think they're going away. I'm not a holder. I follow them. I think it's a cultural phenomena. I think it's really interesting. Because it's a New England story, if you haven't seen the GameStop movie, watch it. It's literally like a Boston guy led the movement, which is kind of cool and very interesting. And I think that there are some lessons from what was happening with GameStop, which, again, it was the stock market, but there's an analogy there. And so I think it's a space to watch. What do you think?
I think they're cute and fun. And I think they're interesting to stress test the chains themselves. It's similar to inscriptions, I think. There's a technical aspect to it. And I think the most clever founders will use them as go-to-market. I think sometimes it's challenging to fully build a product around it. We'll see if that kind of can happen in some of these, but like if you look at DGen on base, it's used for tipping, and it's very interesting seeing people coalesce around it. But it's also be mindful that people like to gamble, speculate. We've seen versions of these before, and so like most things, there's always like nuggets of interesting things, and it's better look at those, and it's very easy to be cynical about them as a whole. But and with that, I think we're at time. Hopefully we can get a round of applause for this amazing panel. Thank you so much. And Chen, I'll hand it to you.
Thank you, speakers. So we have room 108 available and reserved for a Q&A session after if you guys have questions. And there's also an amendment to the schedule, and we'll have the Hedera CEO speaking in room 103 starting now as well. Thank you.